I never believed in love at first sight. To me, love was something that unfolded slowly, like the pages of a novel, one chapter at a time. I was a practical girl, strong-willed and determined to live a life on my own terms. But the moment I met him, I realized that everything I believed about love had been wrong. It was a rainy Thursday evening when I first saw him. I was running late, of course, dashing through the crowded streets of the city to make it to an important meeting. As I hurried around the corner, trying to avoid the downpour, I collided with someone. My heart nearly stopped, and my papers scattered across the wet sidewalk. "Sorry," I exclaimed, bending down to gather the papers. But before I could even reach them, a pair of hands appeared beside me, quickly scooping them up. When I looked up, I saw him. He was taller than me, with dark hair that curled slightly at the ends, a strong jawline, and eyes that seemed to hold stories in them. Stories I desperately wanted to hear. He flashed me an apologetic smile, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. I couldn't explain why, but at that moment I felt as though time had stopped. "Here you go," he said softly, handing me my papers. His voice was deep and smooth, like warm honey on a cold morning. I managed to smile back, a little too flustered to speak properly. "Thanks," I muttered, tucking my papers into my bag. He didn't move immediately, and neither did I. There was something in the air between us, an unspoken connection that I couldn't deny. I felt drawn to him in a way I had never felt before, like there was something magnetic pulling us closer. "Can I walk you to where you're going?" he asked, his tone casual, but there was a warmth in his eyes that told me he was serious. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say. This wasn't like me, meeting someone randomly and then letting them walk me to my meeting. But there was something so disarming about him that I found myself nodding before I could stop myself. "Sure." And just like that, we began walking, together, our footsteps in sync. I couldn't help but feel a little giddy, my heart racing faster than it should have been. But the thing was, I wasn't scared. Not of him, not of what this could mean. It was as if, in that brief encounter, everything had shifted. He had come into my life like a burst of sunlight after a storm, and I had no idea what to expect from this new chapter. We walked side by side, the rhythm of our steps sinking together effortlessly. I tried to focus on my meeting, but every time I glanced at him, my thoughts wandered. There was something about his presence that felt familiar, yet entirely new. His smile was subtle but kind, and his eyes were like an ocean I could easily drown in, full of mystery and quiet depth. "So," he said, breaking the silence between us, "where are you headed?" I glanced at him, surprised by the question. I hadn't realized that I was so focused on him that I hadn't paid attention to anything else. "Oh, just a meeting," I answered, trying to sound casual, though I knew my heart was racing. "It's at a design firm nearby. I am trying to convince them to take me on as a freelance graphic designer." "That sounds interesting," he said, his voice thoughtful. "I've always admired design. It's impressive how people can create something beautiful out of nothing just through their imagination." I smiled at his words. It wasn't every day someone appreciated my line of work. Yeah, it's a great feeling when you can bring someone's vision to life. "What about you?" I asked, curious. "What do you do?" He paused for a moment before answering. "I'm a writer." The simple response caught me off guard. A writer? It wasn't something I expected from someone who seemed so real, like they belonged in the world around us. I had always imagined writers to be mysterious, lost in their heads, removed from the ordinary. "A writer?" I repeated, smiling. "That's cool. What do you write?" He chuckled softly. "Stories mostly." short fiction, novels, some poetry now and then, whatever comes to mind. I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. You must be good at it if you can make a living out of it. He shrugged, looking modest. I'm not famous or anything, but I've had a few things published, enough to keep me going at least. The more we talked, the more I felt like I was being pulled into his world, and it felt strangely natural. I wondered if he felt the same way about me. But I couldn't tell. He was calm, composed, as if nothing could throw him off balance. Meanwhile, my insides were like a storm, a rush of emotions I didn't know how to handle. Well, I'd like to hear some of your work, I said, a little flustered, but eager. Maybe you could show me sometime. His smile deepened, as if he were amused by my interest. I could, if you're really interested, he said, but only if you promise to be brutally honest. I laughed, relieved to find some common ground. Brutally honest is my specialty. He laughed too, and for a moment the world around us felt lighter, like it had become smaller and just for the two of us. As we neared my destination, I realized that the walk had been almost too short. I didn't want it to end. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, whether I was looking for something specific, something meaningful, but whatever it was, I hadn't found it yet. We stood at the entrance to the building, neither of us making a move to leave just yet. Well, I said reluctantly, I guess this is where we part ways. He looked at me, his expression unreadable for a moment, before his lips curled into a smile. I suppose so. His voice softened as though he were giving the moment more weight than it deserved. But maybe we'll run into each other again sometime. I smiled back, the words catching in my throat. I wanted to say something, anything, that would extend this fleeting connection, but all I could manage was a simple, I'd like that. With a last glance, I turned to walk inside, my heart fluttering as I stepped into the building, but a part of me was still standing outside, lingering in the rain with him. 2 weeks passed. I tried to shake the memory of him. I told myself it was just a random encounter, nothing more than a brief moment in time. And yet, the more I tried to forget, the more his face stayed in my thoughts, his voice echoing in my mind like a soft melody I couldn't ignore. I had gone on with my life, buried in my work and busy with deadlines. I had my meetings, my projects, my late-night design sessions, and all of it kept me distracted. But every time I took a break, I found myself thinking about him. Then, one day, when I least expected it, I saw him again. It was a Saturday morning, and I was walking through a local park, grabbing coffee before heading to a freelance project at a cafe. As I sipped my drink, enjoying the quiet of the early morning, I spotted him sitting on a bench near the lake, a book open in his hands. For a moment, I thought I was imagining things, but as I stepped closer, I realized it was him, no mistake about it. My heart did a little flip, and I suddenly felt self-conscious, unsure if I should approach him, but before I could talk myself out of it, I found myself walking over to him, the cool morning air surrounding me like a comforting embrace. "Fancy seeing you here," I said, my voice a little unsure but warm. He looked up from his book, surprised at first, then his face broke into that familiar, easy smile that made my heart skip. "Well, if it isn't my favorite graphic designer," he said, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. "I didn't expect to run into you here." I smiled, feeling the strange sense of déjà vu that only came from the most unexpected of reunions. "I could say the same about you." He chuckled, marking the page of his book and setting it down beside him. "Come sit with me," he said, patting the bench next to him. I hesitated for just a moment, then joined him. There was no hesitation in his movements, no question in his invitation. It felt easy, as if this was something we had done before, even though we hadn't. "So, what are you reading?" I asked, glancing at the book. He picked it up, holding it out for me to see. "It's a collection of short stories. I've been working on something similar, so I'm taking some inspiration." I nodded, impressed. "That sounds interesting. I'm always curious about the creative process." "Maybe I'll tell you about mine," he said, his voice lowering slightly. "But first, tell me how your meeting went the other day. Did they take you on?" I smiled, happy to talk about something that was close to my heart. "Yes, actually. They signed me on for a few projects, and it's going really well. Thanks for asking." "That's great," he said with a nod. "I had a feeling you'd do well." His words were kind, but there was something in his eyes, something that made me wonder if he was more than just polite. My heart raced again, that familiar feeling of something more slowly stirring beneath the surface. He turned slightly toward me, his face now just inches away. "So, what else have you been up to?" I couldn't help but smile. The usual, trying to make a living, staying busy, and getting lost in my work. "Sounds like you've got your hands full," he said. "But maybe you should take a break sometime, have some fun." I nodded, but my thoughts were already drifting. Maybe. Before either of us could speak again, there was a slight shift in the air between us, a quiet understanding of something unspoken. I could feel it in my chest, the pull toward him, the growing curiosity, the fluttering possibility that this could be something more than a random encounter